My interest is on inequalities in health and inequalities more broadly. For today, I'm going to talk about inequalities in later life, as you can see from the talk. My motivation is in part because I feel that as an empirical exercise, the description of inequalities in later life has really not got very far, or certainly not until relatively recently. And so we focus very much on younger people and on working age people, not really focused on the ways in which inequalities play out in later life. So in part I want to give you some description of the extent of inequality in later life, and in part to show you how that's evolving over time, so differences across different generations of older people. That's part of what I want to do. Another part of what I want to do is also to think about the processes, the causal processes that lead to these inequalities, and I think we can learn a lot by studying causal processes in later life and moving away from working age life and young life to understand causal processes. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. But the other really big motivation for me to do this is really to think about policy and the ways in which later life have been neglected, I would say entirely neglected or almost entirely neglected by the social determinants field. And I think you can see that in the policy recommendations that Michael showed us earlier today. You can also see it in the more general discussion. And in that there is a sense that later life is too late. If we don't do stuff in childhood, it's too late. And I want to provide a counter-argument and talk a little bit about the things that happen to older people and how we can actually make a difference in later life. So part of it is that policy motivation. But you'll also see that I put the word class up on my title, which I've added in from the title that you've seen advertised. And that really is partly about how we think about how inequalities are generated. So what are the sources that are driving inequalities? And again, using later life to do that, I think is a more general point to make. So here I'm not interested in class as a variable in my data. And in fact, you'll see that I don't really use class very much as a variable in my data. Rather, I'm interested in the ways in which classes reflect the organisation of power in our society. So this connects directly with some of the stuff that Mike was saying earlier about power and the importance of power. He didn't really say very much about it, and I probably won't say a great deal about it either. But I'll try and pick up on this as I end my talk as well, to think about the ways in which power is organised in our society. And one of those dimensions is class. And so how class shapes our experiences, but also, if we're going to make a difference, who has the power and how might we possibly influence them is something that I think we really need to think about. Okay, having given you a long introduction, I'm now going to kind of just turn back to the question of ageing, and why ageing is, in my view, why I think is particularly important. And you have here, and this quote that I have here, and the next one that I'm going to show you is from 1999. So the ageing demographic is not a problem that is at the last 5 years. It's something that we've known for a very long time, and something that has concerned think tanks, commissions, and policymakers and politicians for a very long time. And indeed, as you can see from the blue boxes, commentators as well. Of course, the ageing of our populations is a sign of success, and it is worth reminding ourselves of that. It's about increasing life expectancy, largely driven by increasing life expectancy, also by changes in fertility, but that's about people having choice over their fertility. And so largely a reflection of success of our societies in terms of improving the health on average of our populations and the choice on average of our populations. But it's presented to us as a terrible disaster, a policy crisis. How do we cope with the increasing dependency of our population that's reflected in the growing numbers of older people? Make people work longer, change tax regimes, reduce welfare regimes, and so on. Of course, ageing isn't just about that, and as the increasing life expectancy has shown, ageing is also about the positives that have happened. And importantly, as the quote again from the same commission says, demographic ageing brings with it systematic transformations of all spheres of social life. So behind these daunting fiscal projections I just briefly alluded to, we have a longer term dynamic affecting all domains of our lives. What will it be like to live in societies that are much older than any we have ever known or imagined? And what that says to us, and there's a field of study around cultures of aging, what that says to us is what it means to be older is changing. How older people are represented in our society is changing. And we can think of that in cultural, social dimensions, but we can also think about it in very simple economic and health terms as well, which I do a little bit in those bullets that are below there. So, we've got an aging population, increasing life expectancy. Dependency also depends upon morbidity. If we're also seeing a compression of morbidity, then maybe things aren't quite so bad for both older people themselves and for populations as a whole. The experience of being old could be changing. Within that is also a literature about third age, which many of you will have come across, I'm sure, in one form or another. But the idea that somewhere in our lives we have this space where we're no longer committed to doing certain things like working and having children, looking after children, and where we may have money and where we may be able to spend time engaged in a set of pursuits which are rewarding, self-fulfilling, and fun. And within that might be creative activities that are contributing to society as a whole, thinking about volunteering, grandparenting, being involved in civic and social activities that make a difference to society. So again, the experience of aging is changing. But the important point, and of course this is bringing you back to the question of inequalities, the important point is that these changes in health and these changes in wealth and the opportunity to have these spaces where we can be creative contributors to society are class dependent. This isn't something that's happening for everybody. And that's going to be a kind of core issue that I want to maintain throughout my talk. And it's a core issue that's reflected in these two pictures. So I, as you've heard, work in Manchester, at the University of Manchester. The city of Manchester was one of the first WHO age-friendly cities, the first tranche of age-friendly cities, and has spent for several decades now spent time thinking about the position of older people within the city, and done a lot of activities to try and promote the city as a place where people can grow old and can enjoy themselves. And that's reflected in the picture on the right, where several years ago we had this Manchester Full of Life festival, which was targeted around celebrating age, promoting cultural spaces for older people, and engaging older people in broader community activities. The image of the vibrant, happy, engaged older person contrasted with the image which was a few years earlier, but this is at the time when the extension of working lives was first being mooted by politicians and policy groups. And the fear that frail older people will end up having to work. But these two images are not just about that, I think. What they do is they reflect the contrasting experiences of aging, and contrasting experiences that I would say are an embodiment of class processes. And as I said, that's a kind of theme that I want to keep throughout this talk. So, I'm going to say something very, very briefly about methods, just to let you know what I'm doing and what kind of data I'm using. So, for the pieces of data that I'm going to show you, I'm going to use the English Longitudinal Study, which I've been involved in since its inception, working with Michael Marmot, James Banks and others in doing this. It's a longitudinal study, which means that we can observe changes in people's experiences over time, a longitudinal study of older people, and a longitudinal study that collects very rich information on a number of domains of people's lives. So for a study of inequalities in later life, it's perfect. We have very good health measures, we have very good economic measures, we have very good social measures, and so on. Importantly, what I've got is a set of data that cover a period of 8 years, which means I can track changes in individual circumstances over time. And I'll be using that to show you some of the important class differences, but also important differences across different age cohorts. And the final few slides are about, final few bullet points are about methods. So that's about using the longitudinal data, using multi-level modelling, about looking at different cohorts or different generations by splitting the population into 5-year age groups, so that they have overlapping ages, so I can show changes in experience over time for different cohorts. And I'm going to focus on really just two outcomes, though we have many more, of course, that we can study. One is a broad outcome of frailty, which we're using the Ken Lockwood Frailty Index to demonstrate that. And so thinking about compression and morbidity, as an example, frailty is a marker of overall morbidity, and then seeing how that is patterned by class and how it changes over time. And then affect, using a measure of depression symptomatology, the Centre for Epidemiological Studies depression scale. And that's just a linear score in showing how depression symptomatology is dependent upon transitions and context. So enough on methods. And the first thing I want to do is talk about this question of compression of morbidity. And just to remind you, the question here is, as life expectancy is increasing, are we seeing a compression of morbidity? So is this problem of dependency partly a consequence of increasing or high levels of morbidity in the older population, or are we seeing levels of morbidity reducing potentially in the older population as life expectancy increases? I'm going to show you a few demonstration slides. So these aren't data I'm going to show you now, but really going to show you, here I'm trying to show you, illustrate what the data is going to show you later in a slightly more complex slide. So here I have two age cohorts, two imaginary age cohorts. People who are 70 in 2002, 2003, and people who are 70 8 years later, 2010, 11. And if there's no compression of morbidity, this is what you would expect to see. That the growth of frailty in those populations is at the same rate, so the slope of those lines is the same, and the lines overlap. So at the age of 70, the rate of frailty is the same. So no compression of morbidity in this example. In this example, we see marked compression of morbidity. So the red line is much lower than the blue line. So at the age 70, the levels of frailty are much lower for the younger cohort compared with the older cohort. And the slope of the line is different. So the growth of frailty within the younger cohort is lower. But of course, we might also be seeing this. And there is an argument that this is happening, partly as a consequence of obesity, or the kind of stuff that we heard about this morning. That the level of frailty in the more recent cohort is higher than the level of frailty in the older cohort at age 70, and the slope is steeper. So the rate of change in frailty. And this is, of course, the nightmare scenario that we are concerned about when we think about aging populations. What do the data show us? They show us this. So what I have here are 5-year age groups. So each of these lines is a 5-year age group, and that is the growth in the level of frailty that's happening for that 5-year age group. And then where the lines overlap at a particular age point, you can see the level of frailty in two adjacent cohorts. So you can see whether the level of frailty is different for two adjacent cohorts, and you can also see whether it's growing at a different rate. And what this slide shows are two broad things. First, if you look here at these three lines, at a particular age point, frailty in the more recent cohorts is higher than frailty in the older cohorts. So this is a worrying finding. The compression of morbidity hypothesis is not supported in any way, according to that finding. See something slightly different than the younger cohorts, where there is a possibility that levels of frailty are lower and potentially growing at a slower rate. But this is very worrying. As more recent cohorts age, we can see higher levels of frailty, is what it suggests. Of course, my interest is in inequality. And so what I show here are the same frailty growth curves for the richest fifth of the population and the poorest fifth of the population in England. So the higher lines are the poorest fifth, and as you can see, they're all much higher than the lines for the richer. It's what we'd expect. We know about inequalities in health. It's what we'd expect. What you see here is a very large growth in levels of frailty in the poorest fifth of the population. This is the poorest fifth of the population. So overall, the wealth of that group is increasing. This is the poorest fifth of the population. And for the richest fifth of the population, well, it kind of overlaps, I think. There might be some suggestion of a growth of frailty for some of those age cohorts, but on the whole, it looks pretty much the same. So, the increase in frailty that I showed you in the previous slide is being driven entirely by the increases in the poorest segments of the population. It's an argument to think seriously about inequalities. The other argument to think seriously about inequalities, of course, is a social justice argument that Michael briefly offered to us this morning. Those two lines kind of bound a lower and upper bound of frailty over a over an 8-year growth period. And what you can see is the levels of frailty for this cohort, who centre around age 80, are pretty much the same as the levels of frailty for that cohort, who centre around the age of 70. A 10-year difference in levels of frailty between the richest and poorest fifth of the population. So, very marked inequalities between the richest fifth and the poorest fifth, but also, if we're looking prospectively, we're seeing these inequalities increasing, and most worryingly, we're seeing the health of the poorest fifth of the population deteriorate. I'm now going to talk about well-being and transitions, and this is really coming back to the kind of policy question. Is it too late to do stuff for older people? Is it all set by childhood? Is childhood deterministic of what happens to us in later life, or do things happen to us in later life that shape our outcomes? We have a broader programme of work that's focused on the question of well-being. Here I'm just really going to talk about negative affect, so this measure of depressive symptomatology, and show how it relates to some of the things that happen to us in later life. But first I'll start with a descriptive. I'm sorry, the slide has shrunk, or the graph has shrunk, but hopefully you can still see it reasonably clearly. You have this U-shaped relationship of negative affect with age. And this has been well documented now by a number of studies that well-being has this U-shaped or inverted U-shaped relationship with age. So well-being improves as you move into your 60s, and then decreases as you move into your 80s. So what is it about moving into your 60s that improves your well-being, and what is it about moving into your 80s that decreases your well-being, and how is that patterned by social inequality? I'm sorry, all these slides seem to have got smaller. All of these graphs seem to have got smaller. I hope you can see them reasonably well. So, the paler of these blue lines, the green of these blue lines, is the one that I've just shown you. When you take into account marital status, and primarily the fact that our spouses die, as we do, if you take that into account, then well-being doesn't deteriorate so rapidly in later life. That's being driven, that difference is being driven by the fact that our spouses' partners die. If you take into account health, then you see something that's really positive. If you stay healthy, if your partnership doesn't change, then your well-being improves from your 50s onwards. Depression symptomatology drops, and other markers of well-being show exactly the same relationship. A positive story about aging. Where does class fit into all of this, or socioeconomic factors? When you control for socioeconomic factors, it makes no difference whatsoever, so that's the final line. Why does it make no difference? It makes no difference because age is, in our contemporary society, pretty much unrelated to socioeconomic position. Older people are much poorer than younger people anymore. And so the age relationship remains after you control for socioeconomic position. But of course, these two things, dying and poor health, are highly correlated with socioeconomic position. So when I say if you control for these things, your well-being improves, it's only some segments of our society who don't experience those things, or only experience them very late in life. So for those of us who are wealthy enough, well off enough, in a good enough position to maintain our health for a long time, to maintain our relationships for a long time, then we can look forward to a good aging. But if we don't, then we can look forward to this U-shaped pattern where our well-being deteriorates very rapidly in later life, increasing depression and symptomatology. But of course, socioeconomic position does matter in terms of well-being. So this is a relationship between negative affect and socioeconomic position, measured by wealth, split into quintiles. As I said, there's no age relationship here, but there is a socioeconomic position relationship here. The lines are neatly stacked on top of each other. The poorer you are, the higher the level of depression symptomatology you have. So I've talked about two types of transition that happen to us as we grow older. One is about death of spouse or death of partner. The other is about our own health and how that impacts on our well-being in later life. And I've pointed to how these are related to socioeconomic position. I also want to talk about another key transition that happens to us, and happens to us earlier on in that U-shaped chart that I showed you. And that's movement out of work and staying in work. And of course, this is an area of great policy concern at the moment because of the extended working lives. And here, what I want to do is show you that retirement is not an equal process, and that staying in work is not an equal process. And so, on average, when you look at the impact of retirement on health, look at the impact of retirement on well-being, you see no relationship. People who retire look pretty much like those who stay the same, those who stay working. And if you look at the relationship between staying in work post-state pension age and health and well-being, again you find no relationship, on average. But of course these transitions, the motivations for staying in work, the transition out of retirement are complex, and they're not simple transitions, they're complex transitions. I'm getting upset now, all of my slides, all of my graphs have been reduced in size. What I have here is retirement, and retirement is classified into involuntary, routine, and voluntary. Routine is when you reach state pension age. Involuntary is when you're forced out of work. Voluntary is when you choose to leave. You choose to leave because you want to spend time enjoying yourself, you want to do different types of things. And what you find is that this, on average, non-existent relationship between retirement and well-being is very different for those who are forced out of work and those who choose to leave work. People who are forced out of work have a decrease in their well-being compared with those who stay in work, compared with those who are forced out of work. And on the other hand side of the slide, I'm going to show you the same. I'm going to show you the same for wealth. So this is, again, quintiles of wealth, the richest fifth, the poorest fifth, and the group in the middle. And you can see that people who retire poor have a detriment to their well-being, and people who retire rich have an increase in their well-being. So when you see that U-shaped relationship with well-being, part of that can be differentiated according to your socioeconomic position. The experience of retirement is very different for those who retire wealthy and those who retire poor, very different for those who choose to retire compared with those who don't retire. And you see something pretty similar for people who stay working. Why do people stay working after state pension age? They stay working primarily for two reasons. One is because they enjoy their work. So that's people like us, and certainly people like academics like me, who continue to work. They enjoy their work, they get lots of reward from their work. And people who have to work because they don't have enough money. When you look on average, you see no effect. And I've given you three indicators here. Moved a little bit off script here with three indicators rather than just a depression indicator. On average, partly because we're interested in whether work improves cognitive function. Compared with those who stop working, people who stay in work have on average no difference in terms of their well-being, in terms of their health, and in terms of their cognition. When you separate out those who are working, because those who are working in good employment conditions and those who are working in poor employment conditions, and here we use an effort reward model to do that. you see that those who are working in poor employment conditions have a detriment to their depression and to their... Magical. You can now, I'll try to go back and you can see all the other slides as well. Yeah, so those who are working in poor quality work, compared with those who are working in high quality work, have a decrease in their depression over time. Sorry, a worsening of their depression over time. It's the other way around, of course, the slide. It's good quality work compared with low quality work. So they have, those in good quality work have a decrease in their depression over time, have an improvement in their health over time. Cognition doesn't show much of a difference. And you can see the very wide confidence intervals. I don't think we had the power to actually measure that appropriately. So, staying in work is good if you're in good quality work. Extended working lives agenda is fine if it's encouraging people to stay in good quality work. It's not very good if you're moving people into positions where they're in insecure, uncertain work, part-time work, 0 hours contracts, and so on, which is where the extended working lives agenda is moving. Okay, I now want to turn to the kind of main theme of the talk, having kind of, I guess, charted the inequalities, shown how the inequalities are increasing over time, show how those inequalities do relate to things that happen to us in later life, how we retire, how we experience health, and so on. I now want to talk a little bit about the ways in which class works in later life. And particularly complain a little bit about the ways in which inequalities in health have been studied in the kind of epidemiological, public health and sociological fields. So inequalities in health research largely operationalizes class as a measure of occupation. And what that means is that we study people of working age. We've historically studied men of working age. Class is largely thought about in terms of labour position on material and psychosocial factors. We know the literature in terms of, and the debates within the literature in terms of whether these pathways are material, a consequence of living standards, or whether they're to do with psychosocial factors, and how those pathways impact on outcomes. But the psychosocial side, and I do want to emphasise the psychosocial side in my next slide, the psychosocial side within the literature is largely operationalised in terms of the work context. And I've just done that in the previous slide, of course. Is thinking about work conditions and how the work conditions shape people's experiences. But, and I would argue in the contemporary world, occupational class is not a great measure, because it doesn't really reflect our class positions very well. Largely in terms of the ways in which our societies are structured by consumption, and where social and cultural capital are particularly important. And this is particularly important in terms of people post-retirement, because of the weakening association between occupation and their position in society post-retirement. So as I said earlier, studying class in later life allows us to think more creatively about class, moving beyond occupation. Now I won't go through this in detail, but this gives you a sense of the kind of things that we've been studying. So thinking about how and why class might relate to health in later life, and indeed more generally. And thinking about the pathways through which it operates, so work quality is one pathway, wealth and material circumstances is another pathway, but most importantly this stuff in the middle about what people do with their time, the opportunities they have in their time, and how they can make best use of their time to get engaged in rewarding, fulfilling activities. And then how that relates to health and well-being. And this actually is an empirical model, and the colours represent the strength of associations. Importantly, there I have social status, which I would have put more centrally in the slide, but there wasn't enough room. But social status is a marker of how we feel about where we are in society, which is partly driven by wealth, partly driven by work, but also very strongly driven by what we do, which is driven in turn by social and cultural capital. But in this model, I'm arguing that we need to think just a little bit differently about class and the resources that class give us. But inequalities are really important. So I've talked about inequalities in terms of their relationship. This chart shows you how wealth is distributed in the population according to tenths of the population. These are survey data, so it excludes the really poor and it excludes the really, really, really rich. But even in this, you see that 43% of the wealth is held by the top 10th of the population. 60% by the top 2/10, and almost 3/4 by the top 3/10 of the population. Almost no wealth in the bottom half of the population. Is it changing? It's not changing. We talk about social mobility. We hear lots of talk about social mobility. These are again data from ELSA. We've seen no shifts in social mobility by class origin across several cohorts of people. So those born in younger than 1920s, 20 to 29, 30 to 39, and so on. These are your odds of appearing in a professional class in comparison with those who are semi-unskilled manual, and you see those odds remain for the class part of this remarkably high and don't change across these cohorts. The higher up the class origin scale you get. That doesn't mean there's no change, of course, which is why I put gender there. There are marked changes that are happening in our societies, but they're not improving class mobility. These class structures remain. Okay, I know I'm going over time, so I'm going to try and conclude reasonably quickly. I've got 2 slides of conclusion. I'll try and go through them quickly. And apologies for rushing in the last few slides. So, the things that we're interested in are strongly related to age, of course, health, well-being, and so on. Importantly, the relationship between age and these outcomes varies by cohort. And I tried to show you that in terms of the frailty measures. Importantly, the things that happen to us in later life do affect our outcomes. So marital status, and particularly widowhood or widowerhood, the onset of health and disability and its impact on well-being, our wealth, and the ways in which we might make the retirement transition. All of these things are very, very strongly related to class. The bad things that happen to us, or the good things that happen to us when we grow older, are strongly related to class. I haven't really talked about this very much, but of course the ways in which class operates, and I did talk about it a little bit in terms of cultural and social capital, the ways in which class operates is changing over time. The structures around us are changing over time. Occupational opportunities are changing over time. And that's particularly important in terms of thinking about extended working lives, in terms of thinking about pensions, and so on. And then my final slide is to say that class inequalities are significant in later life, and they appear to be persistent across cohorts and possibly growing across cohorts. So newer generations of older people are facing more significant inequalities. Class structures all of the things that we're interested in, whether it's very proximal or very distal to the health outcomes we're focused on. The kind of pathway analysis that people like us have been doing show both material and psychosocial pathways, the connections between pathways. But we do need to think about class differently, not just about occupation, not just about wealth, but also about the other resources that go with class. And here, social capital, cultural capital are important. I make reference to Bourdieu, who of course has talked about class in those kind of ways. Final point, implications for policies. We're in an era where ageing is seen as the big policy challenge, or one of the big policy challenges. It's talked about like global warming or climate change. But all of the policy innovation that is happening around ageing has no relation to class inequality. In fact, most of those policy innovations are going to increase class inequalities. Here we have an opportunity to make a difference. Here someone like Michael has the opportunity to influence. We are going through policy reform. And my argument here is that we really need to think about how policy reform is either increasing inequality in later life or reducing inequality in later life. We need to think about ways of doing policy reform, pension reform, extended working life reform, that actually makes things better for poorer people rather than better for richer people. Okay. Thank you very much.